The October wind cut through the Wyoming Territory like a blade, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant promise of winter. Sarah McKenna pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she hurried along the wooden platform of Bitter Creek Station, her boots clicking against the weathered planks. The setting sun painted the endless prairie in shades of gold and amber, but Sarah's mind was far from the beauty of the landscape. In her leather satchel, she carried documents that would destroy her father's reputation and bring down the entire Northern Pacific Railroad's expansion into Lakota territory. For weeks, she had suspected something was amiss with the company's land acquisitions, but seeing the forged treaties and bribery records had shattered her world completely. "Sarah!" called out James Morrison, her father's business partner, as he approached with his usual charming smile. Behind him walked two other men she recognized from the railroad office, men whose faces now seemed sinister in the dying light. "Your father sent us to escort you back to town. He's worried about you traveling alone so late." Sarah's grip tightened on her satchel. "I can manage perfectly well, Mr. Morrison. The evening train will take me directly to Cheyenne." "I'm afraid that won't be possible." Morrison's smile faded, replaced by something cold and calculating. "You see, Sarah, we know what you've discovered, and we simply cannot allow you to reach Cheyenne with those documents." The two men flanked her before she could react. One was Buck Henley, a scarred brute who handled the railroad's more unsavory business. The other was Tom Garrett, a company accountant whose nervous demeanor had always made Sarah uncomfortable. Now she understood why. "My father will—" Sarah began, but Morrison cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Your father knows nothing of this, and he never will. As far as he'll know, you simply disappeared on your way to visit your aunt in Denver. A terrible tragedy, really. These frontier territories can be so dangerous for a young woman traveling alone." Terror gripped Sarah's chest as they dragged her away from the station, past the water tower, and into the gathering darkness. The distant whistle of the approaching eastbound train echoed across the prairie, a mournful sound that seemed to herald her doom. They forced her down the embankment to where the iron rails stretched endlessly into the night. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing rumble of the locomotive. "You don't have to do this. I won't tell anyone. I'll destroy the documents myself." Henley's rough hands bound her wrists and ankles with rope, securing her to the cold steel rails. "Nothing personal, Miss McKenna," he muttered, avoiding her eyes. "Just business." The train's headlamp cut through the darkness like a burning eye, growing larger and brighter with each passing second. Sarah could feel the vibration of the approaching engine through the rails beneath her, a rhythmic pounding that matched her racing heart. She struggled against her bonds, but the rope held firm. From the ridge above, a figure watched in the moonlight. Tall Bear had been tracking the white men's movements for days, knowing they were up to something that would bring more trouble to his people. He had not expected to witness an attempted murder. The warrior's dark eyes took in the scene below, the woman bound to the tracks, the men retreating to watch their grim handiwork from a safe distance, and the approaching train that would soon claim an innocent life. In his culture, to witness such evil and do nothing would stain his spirit forever. Without hesitation, Tall Bear knocked an arrow to his bow and sent it flying through the night. The shaft struck the rails 20 yards ahead of the bound woman, the fletching catching the train's headlamp and glowing like a beacon. The engineer, seeing the arrow embedded in the track, pulled the brake cord with all his might. The massive locomotive screamed against the rails, sparks flying into the darkness as iron wheels fought for purchase. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the heat of the engine's breath as it thundered toward her. The ground shook beneath her as the train fought to stop, the screech of metal on metal drowning out all other sounds. With a final, shuddering groan, the locomotive came to rest mere inches from Sarah's feet. Steam hissed from the engine as the engineer leaned out of the cab, his face pale with shock. "What in the hell?" he began, then saw the arrow protruding from the rails. Tall Bear emerged from the shadows like a ghost, his knife slicing through Sarah's bonds with swift, practiced movements. She gasped as feeling returned to her hands and feet, her eyes meeting those of her unexpected savior. In the lamplight, she saw a man, perhaps 30 years old, with strong features and dark hair braided with leather. His buckskin clothing and the bow across his shoulder marked him clearly as Lakota. "Can you walk?" he asked in accented English, his voice low and urgent. Sarah nodded, though her legs trembled as she struggled to stand. Yes, I think so, but why did you—" "No time for questions," Tall Bear interrupted, helping her to her feet. "The men who did this will return soon. We must go." Above them, Shouts echoed from the ridge as Morrison and his men realized their plan had failed. The sound of boots on gravel grew closer as they scrambled down the embankment. "There! The Indian helped her escape!" Garrett's voice cracked with panic. Tallbear's hand found Sarah's elbow, steadying her as they moved away from the train. "Stay close to me," he whispered. "Your people will shoot first and ask questions later." As they disappeared into the darkness beyond the train's lamplight, Sarah clutched the satchel containing the documents that had nearly cost her life. Behind them, the voices of her would-be killers grew more distant, but she knew this was only the beginning. In saving her life, this Lakota warrior had made himself a target as well. The prairie stretched endlessly before them, vast and unforgiving under the star-scattered sky. Sarah McKenna, daughter of privilege and civilization, now found herself fleeing into the wilderness, with a man whose people were considered enemies of everything she had once believed in. Yet as they ran together through the sage and buffalo grass, she realized that this stranger had shown her more humanity in 5 minutes than the men of her own race had in a lifetime. The train's whistle echoed once more across the plains, a lonesome sound that seemed to mark the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Wyoming Badlands, painting the rocky outcroppings and twisted junipers in muted shades of silver and rust. Sarah McKenna had never known such exhaustion. Her feet were blistered inside her leather boots, her elegant traveling dress torn and dusty from their night-long flight across the unforgiving terrain. Yet she pressed on, following the sure-footed Lakota warrior who had become her unlikely salvation. Tallbear moved with the fluid grace of a man born to this harsh landscape, his moccasined feet finding purchase on loose shale where Sarah's boots slipped treacherously. Every few minutes he would pause and listen, his dark eyes scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit. The railroad men would not give up easily. Too much was at stake. "We must reach the canyon before the sun climbs higher," Tallbear said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They will bring horses and dogs to track us." Sarah nodded, too breathless to speak. Her pampered life in railroad towns had never prepared her for such physical demands. The satchel containing the incriminating documents felt heavier with each step, but she refused to abandon it. Those papers were the only proof of the corruption that had nearly cost her life. As they crested a rocky ridge, the sound of distant horses reached their ears. Tallbear immediately dropped to a crouch, pulling Sarah down beside him. Through the morning haze, they could see a group of riders spreading out across the plain below. Morrison's men, accompanied by what appeared to be a territorial marshal and his deputies. "They've made this official," Sarah whispered, her heart sinking. "They're painting you as a savage who kidnapped a white woman." Tallbear's jaw tightened. "Your people are quick to believe such stories. It makes their conscience easier when they break treaties and steal our land." The bitterness in his voice reminded Sarah of the vast divide between their worlds. Yet here he was, risking everything to protect her, a woman whose very existence represented the encroachment of white civilization on his people's way of life. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have let the train." She couldn't finish the sentence. Tallbear was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the riders below. "My grandmother taught me that all life is sacred. To watch innocent blood spill and do nothing would dishonor her memory." He glanced at Sarah, his eyes softening slightly. "Besides, I have seen what your railroad men do to my people. If they would kill their own kind for paper and gold, what hope do we have for justice?" The sound of horses grew closer, forcing them to move deeper into the canyon system that carved through the Badlands like ancient scars. The walls rose around them, red sandstone streaked with veins of iron that caught the morning light. Sarah's breathing echoed off the narrow walls, each gasp a reminder of her sheltered upbringing. "Tell me about these papers," Tallbear said, as they navigated a particularly treacherous section where the path narrowed to barely shoulder width. "What makes them worth killing for?" Sarah clutched the satchel tighter. "Forged treaties, bribery records, proof that the railroad company has been stealing tribal lands through false agreements and payoffs to corrupt officials. My father, he doesn't know. He truly believes the expansion is legal and beneficial." "And you?" Tallbear asked. "What do you believe?" The question hung in the air between them as they descended into a wider section of the canyon. Sarah had never been forced to examine her own beliefs so starkly. She had grown up accepting the narrative of progress and civilization, never questioning the cost to those who stood in its path. "I believed what I was taught," she said finally, "that we were bringing civilization to the wilderness, that the railroad would benefit everyone. But seeing those documents and knowing what they're willing to do to protect their lies, she shook her head. I can't be part of that anymore. Behind them, the echo of hoofbeats on stone announced that their pursuers had entered the canyon. Tall Bear immediately picked up the pace, leading Sarah through a maze of narrow passages that would slow down mounted riders. His knowledge of the terrain was their only advantage against superior numbers and firepower. This way, he whispered, guiding her toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall. Up close, Sarah could see it was actually a cleverly concealed opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. My people have used these hiding places for generations. They emerged into a small circular chamber, open to the sky above, its walls carved with ancient petroglyphs that seemed to watch over them with silent eyes. A thin trickle of water seeped from the rock face, forming a small pool that reflected the morning sky. We can rest here, Tall Bear said, filling his water pouch from the spring. They will not find this place easily. Sarah collapsed against the smooth stone wall, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her exhaustion. Her hands shook as she accepted the water pouch, the cool liquid a blessing against her parched throat. For the first time since her rescue, she truly looked at the man who had saved her life. Tall Bear was younger than she had first thought, perhaps only a few years older than her own 24 years. His face was strong and angular, marked by the weather and hardship of frontier life, but there was intelligence in his dark eyes, and a gentleness in his movements that contradicted every stereotype she had been taught about his people. What will happen to you? She asked. When they find us, I mean. They'll say you kidnapped me. Perhaps, he replied, checking his bow and the handful of arrows in his quiver, but I have faced worse odds than a few railroad men and their hired guns. The distant sound of voices echoed from the canyon walls, growing closer as their pursuers searched the maze of passages. Sarah's heart raced as she heard Morrison's voice calling out orders, his tone carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. Search every crevice. That savage couldn't have gotten far carrying a woman. Tall Bear's expression hardened at the slur, but he remained silent. Instead, he moved to the concealed entrance and listened carefully to the sounds outside. The voices were moving away, but they would return soon enough. We cannot stay here long, he said quietly. When the sun reaches its peak, we must move again. There is a place, a sacred valley, where my people once held council. If we can reach it, we will have sanctuary. How far? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. 2 days hard travel through country your people have never seen, but there is no other choice. Those men will not stop hunting us, and staying in territory they know will mean death for both of us. Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. She was no longer just a witness to corruption. She was a fugitive, branded as a victim of savage kidnapping. The irony was not lost on her, that the only person trying to protect her was the very type of man her people had taught her to fear. As the sun climbed higher and the sounds of pursuit grew more distant, Sarah found herself studying the ancient symbols carved into the chamber walls. They spoke of a time when this land belonged to no railroad company, when the relationship between human and earth was measured in generations rather than quarterly profits. What do they mean? She asked, gesturing to the petroglyphs. Tall Bear followed her gaze, his expression softening. Stories of the old times, warnings to future generations, reminders that all things are connected, the earth, the sky, the water that gives life. It's beautiful, Sarah said, and meant it. I never knew. Your people see only what can be bought and sold, Tall Bear replied, but without malice. They do not understand that some things are worth more than gold. Outside their hidden sanctuary, the voices of their pursuers had faded to silence, but both knew it was only temporary. Soon they would have to leave this place of peace and venture deeper into the wilderness, where survival would depend on trust between two people from worlds that had been taught to see each other as enemies. Sarah clutched her satchel once more, feeling the weight of the papers that had set these events in motion. The documents that could expose the truth about the railroad's crimes were now her only hope of eventual vindication, if she lived long enough to use them. The second day of their flight brought with it a cruel October blizzard that swept down from the mountains like the breath of winter itself. Sarah had never experienced such cold. It cut through her woolen dress and shawl as if they were made of paper, turning her fingers numb and her breath into clouds of white vapor that froze on her lips. Tall Bear pressed forward through the driving snow, his buckskin clothing and buffalo hide cloak offering better protection against the elements than Sarah's town-made garments. Every few steps, he would turn to check on her, his dark eyes filled with concern as he watched her struggle against the storm. "Not much further," he called over the howling wind, though Sarah could barely make out his words. "The valley is just beyond that ridge." The sacred valley of which he spoke seemed like a myth now, a destination that existed only in hope and desperation. Sarah's legs felt like lead, each step requiring tremendous effort as she pushed through knee-deep snowdrifts. The documents in her satchel had become a burden she could barely carry, but she refused to abandon them, even as her strength failed. Behind them, the storm had erased all traces of their passage, a blessing that came at the cost of nearly unbearable hardship. Morrison's men would be forced to seek shelter until the weather cleared, giving them precious time to reach safety if they survived the journey themselves. "I can't," Sarah gasped, stumbling to her knees in the snow. "I can't go any further." Tall Bear was beside her in an instant, his strong hands lifting her to her feet. "You must," he said firmly. "To stop now means death for both of us." Something in his voice, not anger but an iron determination mixed with genuine compassion, gave Sarah the strength to continue. She leaned heavily on his arm as they climbed the final slope, the wind threatening to tear them from the mountainside with each gust. Then, as suddenly as stepping through a doorway, they crested the ridge and the wind died away. Before them lay a hidden valley, sheltered by high peaks and warmed by natural hot springs that sent columns of steam rising into the grey sky. Even in the storm, Sarah could see that this place was special. Ancient pines grew tall and straight, their branches heavy with snow but unbroken by the wind that raged beyond the valley's protective walls. "The Valley of the Grandfathers," Tall Bear said softly, reverence clear in his voice. "Here, my people came for healing and wisdom. Here no blood has ever been spilled in anger." They descended into the valley, following a narrow trail that wound between the steaming pools. The air grew warmer with each step, and Sarah felt some of her strength returning as the bitter cold released its grip on her bones. Near the center of the valley stood a grove of ancient cottonwoods, their golden leaves carpeting the ground like scattered coins. Beneath the largest tree, someone had built a small shelter, not a teepee but a simple lean-to constructed from pine boughs and buffalo hide. Smoke rose from a carefully banked fire, and Sarah realized with a start that they were not alone in this sanctuary. An elderly Lakota woman emerged from the shelter, her silver hair braided with beads and her weathered face marked by the wisdom of many winters. She studied Sarah with sharp eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, then turned to Tall Bear with a slight smile. "Grandmother Singing Bird," Tall Bear said, bowing his head respectfully. "I did not know you were here." "The spirits told me to wait," the old woman replied in accented English, her voice like wind through dry leaves. "They said a daughter of the Iron Horse would come, carrying truth in her heart and lies in her hands." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. How could this woman know about the documents? How could she have known they were coming? "You are frightened, child," Singing Bird said, stepping closer to Sarah. "You have lived your whole life being told that my people are savages, that we cannot be trusted, yet here you stand alive because my grandson chose to honor the sacred way." I don't understand," Sarah stammered. "How did you know we were coming?" The old woman chuckled, a sound like water over stones. "The same way I know you carry papers that could stop the Iron Horse from destroying more of our homeland. The same way I know you must choose between the world you were born to and the truth you have discovered." Tall Bear helped Sarah to the fire, where the warmth began to thaw her frozen limbs. Singing Bird brought them food, dried meat, pine nut cakes, and a hot tea made from herbs that Sarah couldn't identify, but which filled her with strength and clarity. "Tell me about these papers," Singing Bird said, settling beside the fire with the fluid grace of someone who had lived close to the earth for 8 decades. Sarah opened her satchel with trembling hands, spreading the documents before the old woman. "They prove that the railroad company has been forging treaties and bribing officials to steal tribal lands. My father, he believes the expansion is legal, but these show the truth." Singing Bird examined the papers with surprising literacy, her eyes moving quickly across the legal language and financial records. "Your father is Charles McKenna, the one they call the Iron King?" "Yes," Sarah whispered, shame coloring her voice. "He doesn't know about the corruption. He truly believes he's bringing progress to the frontier." "And what do you believe, daughter of the Iron King?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fire. Sarah looked at Tall Bear, who had risked everything to save her, then at the elderly woman whose people had been driven from their homes by the very progress her father championed. I believe I've been living a lie, Sarah said finally. I believed we were civilizing the wilderness, but we're destroying something beautiful and sacred. These documents, and they're proof that the railroad's expansion is built on theft and murder. Singing Bird nodded slowly. Truth is a heavy burden, child. Once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. But truth is also a weapon, the most powerful weapon there is. Outside their shelter, the storm continued to rage, but the valley remained calm and protected. Sarah felt as if she had entered another world, one where the values her society had taught her to dismiss as primitive were revealed as profound wisdom. What happens now? She asked. Even if we survive this, how can I expose the truth? They'll say I was kidnapped, that I was coerced or driven mad by my ordeal. Perhaps, Singing Bird said, stirring the fire with a weathered stick. But you are not alone. There are others among your people who suspect the truth. A territorial judge named Harrison, a newspaper editor named Welsh, even some members of your Congress who have grown suspicious of the railroad's methods. How do you know this? Sarah asked, amazed. The old woman smiled. We are not as isolated as your people believe. We have ears in your towns, eyes in your meeting places. We know which of your leaders can be trusted and which cannot. Tall Bear had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now he spoke up. Even if we can get the papers to honest men, what then? The railroad has too much power, too much money. They will find a way to discredit the evidence. Not if the story comes from the right source, Singing Bird said, her eyes twinkling. Not if the daughter of the Iron King herself tells the world what she has discovered. Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders. To expose the truth would mean betraying her own father, destroying the family fortune, and likely facing criminal charges herself. But to remain silent would mean allowing the theft and murder to continue. I need time to think, she said. Time you shall have, Singing Bird replied. The storm will blow for 3 days. Your pursuers cannot reach this valley in such weather, and even if they could, they would not violate the sacred nature of this place, not if they wish to leave alive. As if to emphasize her point, the wind beyond the valley's edge howled with renewed fury, while within their protected sanctuary, the only sounds were the gentle bubbling of the hot springs and the soft whisper of falling snow. That night, as Sarah lay wrapped in warm buffalo robes beside the fire, she stared up at the stars visible through the clear air above the valley. Tall Bear slept nearby, his breathing steady and peaceful, while Singing Bird maintained a quiet vigil, her presence both comforting and profound. For the first time since her rescue, Sarah felt truly safe. But she knew this sanctuary was temporary. Soon she would have to return to the world beyond the valley, where the choices she made would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of countless others whose lives hung in the balance between progress and justice. On the third dawn, the storm finally broke. Sarah woke to brilliant sunlight streaming through the valley, turning the snow-covered landscape into a world of diamonds and gold. The silence was profound after days of howling wind, broken only by the gentle murmur of the hot springs and the distant call of an eagle circling overhead. Singing Bird was already awake, tending the fire and preparing what Sarah now recognized as their final meal together. The old woman's face was grave as she handed Sarah a cup of the healing tea that had sustained her through the ordeal. They come, Singing Bird said simply. The storm has passed, and your enemies stir like wolves emerging from their den. Sarah's heart clenched with fear, but also with a strange sense of resolution. The 3 days of sanctuary had given her time to think, to understand what she must do. The documents in her satchel were more than evidence. They were a responsibility she could no longer avoid. I've made my decision, she said, looking between Singing Bird and Tall Bear, who had emerged from the shelter with his bow and quiver. I'm going to expose the truth no matter the cost. Tall Bear's expression was unreadable. You understand what this means. You will be branded a traitor by your own people. Your father will never forgive you. My father raised me to believe in justice, Sarah replied, surprised by the strength in her own voice. If I stay silent, I become part of the evil I've discovered. That would be the real betrayal. Singing Bird nodded approvingly. The spirits have spoken to you, child, but the path ahead is treacherous. How will you reach those who can help you? There's a telegraph office in Laramie, Sarah said, her mind already working through the possibilities. If I can get word to Judge Harrison and the others you mentioned, they might be able to act on this evidence. Laramie is 2 days' ride from here, Tall Bear said, and Morrison's men will be watching every road, every settlement. They know you must surface eventually. Then we'll have to be smarter than they are, Sarah said with determination that surprised even herself. You know this country better than they do. Can you get me to Laramie? Tall Bear exchanged a long look with his grandmother. Some wordless communication passed between them, the kind that comes from a lifetime of shared understanding. Finally, he nodded. There is a way, he said, but it will require great courage from both of us. Before he could explain further, the sound of distant hoofbeats echoed from the valley's entrance. Morrison and his men had found them at last. Sarah felt her newfound resolve waver as she saw the dust cloud rising from the trail that led into their sanctuary. They would dare violate this sacred place? Tall Bear asked, his voice tight with anger. Desperate men care nothing for the sacred, Singing Bird replied. But this valley has protected our people for generations. It will not abandon us now. The riders came into view, Morrison leading a group of perhaps a dozen men, including the territorial marshal and several hard-faced gunmen Sarah didn't recognize. They approached cautiously, clearly uncomfortable with the mystical atmosphere of the valley, but driven by greed and the need to silence a dangerous witness. Sarah McKenna, Morrison called out, his voice echoing off the valley walls. Come out peacefully, and no one needs to get hurt. You've been through a terrible ordeal, but we're here to rescue you. Sarah stepped forward, but Tall Bear caught her arm. Wait, he whispered. Let them come closer. Morrison dismounted and approached on foot, his hand resting on his pistol. Sarah, thank God you're alive. Your father is frantic with worry. This savage kidnapped you, didn't he? Forced you to come here against your will? No, Sarah said clearly, her voice carrying across the valley. He saved my life. Saved me from the men you sent to murder me. Morrison's face darkened. You're obviously not thinking clearly. The ordeal has affected your mind. But don't worry. We'll get you proper medical attention. I'm thinking more clearly than I ever have, Sarah replied. I know what you did, James. I know about the forged treaties, the bribes, the stolen land, and I'm going to make sure the world knows too. The mask of concern finally slipped from Morrison's face, replaced by cold calculation. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, Sarah, but you've left us no choice. He signaled to his men, who began to spread out around the small clearing. Sarah felt Tall Bear tense beside her, his hand moving to his knife. The odds were impossible, 2 people against a dozen armed men. But Singing Bird stepped forward, her aged frame somehow commanding attention from everyone present. You would spill blood in this sacred place? She asked, her voice carrying an authority that made even the hardened gunman hesitate. Stay back, old woman, Morrison snapped. This doesn't concern you. Everything that happens in this valley concerns me, Singing Bird replied. I am its guardian, and I tell you now, no violence will be permitted here. The spirits themselves forbid it. One of the hired guns laughed nervously. Just superstitious nonsense, boss. Let's finish this. But as he raised his rifle, a strange thing happened. The weapon seemed to grow impossibly heavy in his hands, and he found himself unable to pull the trigger. Around the clearing, other men experienced similar difficulties. Guns that wouldn't fire, horses that refused to move forward, an overwhelming sense of unease that made even the bravest among them question their actions. What kind of trickery is this? Morrison demanded, but his voice betrayed his growing fear. No trickery, Singing Bird said calmly. Simply the power of a place that has been sacred for longer than your people have walked this earth. You may enter as guests, but you cannot bring violence here. Morrison's face contorted with rage and frustration. Fine, he snarled. We'll wait. You can't stay here forever, and when you leave this valley, we'll be waiting. Perhaps, Tall Bear said, speaking for the first time since the men arrived. But you forget something, white man. This is our country. We know paths your people have never seen, trails that existed before your iron horse scarred the earth. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of approaching horses came from multiple directions. Sarah watched in amazement as Lakota warriors emerged from concealment around the valley's rim. Not many, perhaps 8 or 10, but enough to change the balance of power completely. Morrison's men looked around nervously, suddenly aware that they were the ones who were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The territorial marshal, a man named Donovan, who had been suspiciously quiet throughout the encounter, finally spoke up. This is getting out of hand, he said. Morrison, I agreed to help you recover a kidnapped woman, not to start a war with the Lakota. She wasn't kidnapped, you fool, Morrison exploded. She has documents that could destroy everything we've built. If those papers reach the wrong hands, then perhaps they should reach the right hands. Donovan interrupted, his tone thoughtful. Miss McKenna, what exactly are you alleging? Sarah seized the opportunity. Marshal Donovan, I have proof that the Northern Pacific Railroad has been forging treaties and bribing officials to steal tribal lands. These documents show systematic corruption going back years. Donovan's expression grew serious. Those are grave accusations. Do you have evidence to support them? I have the evidence right here, Sarah said, holding up her satchel. Financial records, correspondence, even copies of the forged treaties themselves. She's lying, Morrison shouted desperately. She's been brainwashed by these savages. But Donovan was already moving, his hand on his weapon as he faced Morrison. I think I'd like to see those documents, Miss McKenna. And I think Mr. Morrison and his associates need to step back while I examine them. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive. Faced with the combined opposition of the territorial marshal, the Lakota warriors, and the mysterious protective power of the valley itself, Morrison's men had no choice but to retreat. But as they mounted their horses, Morrison's parting words carried a clear threat. This isn't over, Sarah. Your father will disown you when he learns what you've done. You'll be branded a traitor and an outlaw. Is your precious truth worth that? Sarah met his gaze steadily. Yes, she said simply. It is. As the defeated men rode away, Sarah felt the weight of her choice settling on her shoulders. She had chosen truth over family, justice over comfort, and the unknown over the familiar. The path ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in her life, she was walking it with complete conviction. Tall Bear moved to stand beside her, his presence a steady comfort in the face of an uncertain future. Are you ready for what comes next? He asked. Sarah looked out at the valley that had sheltered and transformed her, then at the documents that would soon change everything. I'm ready, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. 6 months later, the spring sun warmed the courthouse steps in Denver as Sarah McKenna emerged from the federal building, her testimony finally complete. The trial of Morrison and his conspirators had drawn national attention, exposing the corruption that had plagued the railroad expansion across the Western Territories. The documents she had nearly died protecting had proven to be the key evidence that brought down an entire network of fraud and murder. But victory had come at a steep personal cost. Her father, Charles McKenna, sat hunched on a bench across the street, his once proud shoulders bent with shame and grief. The revelation of his company's crimes had broken him, though he had been cleared of personal wrongdoing. The Iron King had been dethroned, his empire built on lies now crumbling around him. Sarah approached him slowly, her heart heavy with the knowledge that their relationship might never heal. Father? Charles looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Sarah, you've done what you felt you had to do. I can't say I understand it, but perhaps that's my failing, not yours. The court cleared you of any criminal charges, Sarah said gently. You didn't know what Morrison and the others were doing, didn't I? Charles asked bitterly. Or did I simply choose not to know? How many times did I ignore suspicious contracts, questionable land deals, reports of tribal unrest? I told myself I was building something great, bringing progress to the frontier, but at what cost? Sarah sat beside him on the bench, father and daughter separated by more than just physical distance. It's not too late to make things right. The court has ordered reparations to the affected tribes. You could help ensure they're properly distributed. Charles nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose I could do that. Try to repair some of the damage. He looked at his daughter with eyes that seemed to see her clearly for the first time. You've changed, Sarah. You're stronger than I ever imagined. I had good teachers, she replied, thinking of Tall Bear and Singing Bird, who had opened her eyes to a different way of seeing the world. The Lakota warrior who saved you, Charles said hesitantly. Tall Bear, I believe his name is. The newspapers made quite a hero of him. Sarah's heart warmed at the mention of Tall Bear's name. He is a hero, father. He saved my life when your own business partners wanted me dead. Yes, I owe him a debt I can never repay. Charles struggled with the words, his lifetime of prejudices warring with the undeniable truth of what had happened. The papers say he testified on your behalf, helped convince the court of your truthfulness. Indeed, Tall Bear's testimony had been crucial in establishing the credibility of Sarah's account. His dignified presence in the courtroom, speaking truth in measured English while dressed in traditional Lakota clothing, had challenged every stereotype the white jurors held about his people. Where is he now? Charles asked. Waiting for me, Sarah said simply. We have plans to make. Charles looked puzzled. Plans? Sarah, surely you're not thinking of... I mean the social implications alone. Father, 6 months ago I nearly died because I discovered the truth about railroad corruption. Do you really think I care about social implications now? Before Charles could respond, Sarah saw a familiar figure approaching across the busy Denver street. Tall Bear moved with the same fluid grace she remembered, though he now wore a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, buckskin pants and shirt, with a black coat and hat that marked him as a man who could move between both worlds. He stopped a respectful distance away, waiting for Sarah to conclude her conversation with her father. The gesture spoke volumes about his character and the respect he had learned to show for her family ties, despite everything that had happened. "Mr. McKenna," Tall Bear said formally when Sarah gestured for him to join them, "I am sorry for the pain these revelations have caused you." Charles studied the man who had saved his daughter's life, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "Mr. Tall Bear, is it? I understand I owe you a debt beyond measure." "You owe me nothing," Tall Bear replied. "I did what any honorable man would do." "Nevertheless," Charles said, struggling to find the right words, "if there's anything I can do, any way I can help your people recover from the damage my company has done." "There is something," Tall Bear said thoughtfully. "My people need advocates in the white man's world, someone who understands both the law and the language of business, someone they can trust to help them navigate the new treaties and land agreements." Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand what Tall Bear was suggesting. "You mean someone who could serve as a liaison between the tribes and the government? Someone who could help ensure the new agreements are fair and honestly implemented?" "Exactly," Tall Bear said, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart race. "Someone who has proven her commitment to justice, regardless of personal cost." Charles looked between them, beginning to grasp the implications. "Sarah, this would mean—" "What exactly would this mean?" "It would mean establishing a permanent presence in tribal territory," Sarah explained, her excitement growing as she spoke. "It would mean working closely with tribal leaders to ensure they're not cheated again. It would mean leaving behind everything you've known," Charles finished quietly. "Your society, your connections, your comfortable life." Sarah thought of the sacred valley where she had found sanctuary and purpose, of Singing Bird's wisdom and the strength she had discovered within herself. "I've already left that life behind, Father. The moment I chose truth over comfort, I became someone new." Tall Bear stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Sarah has already proven herself to my people. Grandmother Singing Bird has spoken of her as one who walks between worlds, bringing understanding where there was once only fear and hatred." "And you, Mr. Tall Bear?" Charles asked, his tone carefully neutral. "What role would you play in this one arrangement?" "I would serve as cultural interpreter and guide," Tall Bear replied. "Sarah knows the white man's law, but she would need someone to help her understand tribal customs and traditions. Someone to help her earn the trust of those who have been betrayed too many times before." Charles was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what they were proposing. Finally, he spoke. "This would be unprecedented. A white woman working directly with the tribes, living among them." "The world is changing, Father," Sarah said gently. "The old ways of dealing with the tribes, through force and deception, have failed. Perhaps it's time to try understanding and cooperation instead." "And what of your personal relationship?" Charles asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. "The newspapers have been quite speculative about the nature of your association." Sarah felt her cheeks flush, but she met her father's gaze steadily. "Tall Bear and I have developed a deep respect and affection for each other. Whether that becomes something more, well, that will depend on how our work together develops." Tall Bear added quietly, "In my culture, partnerships are built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Sarah and I have both. The rest will come in its own time, if the spirits will it." Charles stood slowly, his aged frame bearing the weight of all that had transpired. 6 months ago, if someone had told me my daughter would be planning to work with the Lakota, to consider, he shook his head in amazement. But then 6 months ago, I thought I was an honest businessman, bringing civilization to the wilderness. He extended his hand to Tall Bear, who clasped it firmly. "Take care of her," Charles said simply. "She's all I have left, and she's worth more than all the railroads and gold in the territory." "I know," Tall Bear replied, "and she will be honored and protected. I give you my word." As the two men shook hands, Sarah felt tears threaten her eyes. It wasn't the reconciliation she had dreamed of, but it was a beginning, a bridge built across the chasm that had opened between her and her father. 3 days later, Sarah and Tall Bear stood on the platform of the Denver and Rio Grande station, preparing to board a train that would take them to the edge of the frontier and their new life beyond. Sarah carried a single valise containing the few possessions she truly valued: her mother's Bible, a photograph of her family, and the leather satchel that had once contained the documents that changed everything. "Are you certain about this?" Tallbear asked as the train's whistle echoed across the platform. "There will be no going back once we cross into tribal territory." Sarah smiled, thinking of the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a sheltered railroad heiress to a woman capable of choosing her own destiny. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." As the train pulled away from Denver, carrying them toward the sacred valley and the new world they would build together, Sarah reflected on the strange twists of fate that had led her here. She had been left to die on railroad tracks, saved by a single arrow placed by a man her people called Savage. Now she was traveling freely on those same rails, heading toward a future where the barriers between their worlds might finally begin to crumble. The setting sun painted the Colorado landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and in the distance, Sarah could see the peaks that sheltered the valley where her transformation had begun. Soon she would return to that sacred place, not as a fugitive seeking sanctuary, but as a woman who had found her purpose in bridging two worlds that had been at war for too long. Tallbear's hand found hers as the train carried them into the gathering dusk, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Two people from different worlds who had found a common path toward justice, understanding, and perhaps something even deeper and more lasting than either had dared to hope.